Hello and welcome to this session entitled Commercial Law Update 2020. My name is Keith Markham, as you can see, and I'll be your presenter for this particular session today. Let's begin by looking, as always, at our kind of course objectives, and then we'll look at our agenda as well. So, course objectives are fairly straightforward, usual sorts of things. So we're going to look at applicable case law. We're going to look at a series of drafting tips that we can bring out of that case law to the extent relevant. We're going to look at recent enforcement action in a number of areas, including consumer law and data protection. And we're also going to look at potential future developments in some of those areas as appropriate. Now, in terms of the more precise agenda, let's just go through that. There are three main topics. So we'll begin with a discussion of contract law. That will involve a discussion of the following sorts of things. So we'll begin with a discussion of force majeure, two recent cases. Very, very relevant in the light of COVID-19 in terms of the rules, the expectations, causation, things like that. We'll see what those cases have to say. We'll then go on to look at variation of contract. We'll see there's been a recent Court of Appeal decision with regard to precisely how we interpret variation clauses and what's required of the parties. Then we'll go on to look at one example of liquidated damages in the context of interest payments and the like. We'll look briefly at e-signatures and some of the practical issues thrown up by particularly COVID-19, and I'll make some suggestions there. And finally, we'll look at good faith in terms of recent case law about express and implied duties of good faith. We'll then go on to talk about consumer law, and in particular here we'll look at some specific COVID-19 guidance that's been produced by the Competition and Markets Authority. We'll look a little bit at enforcement, and we'll also look at some forthcoming legislative change, which, depending on transition periods and various other things, potentially affects us, but I'm not going to go to town on it particularly today, but I'll just give you the latest position as to where that is. And finally, we'll then go on to talk about data protection, and we've got plenty to say. Here again, a little bit of COVID-19 specific stuff. We'll then talk about enforcement, and in particular, a recent Supreme Court case on the topic of compensation. Right, let's begin then by talking about contract law. So as has already been indicated, we will be looking at these topics: force majeure, variation, liquidated damages, electronic signatures, and good faith. Let's begin then with the highly topical issue of force majeure. So, this case of classic maritime and limbungan is one that is really quite remarkable for any number of good reasons. Now, what happens with this particular case is that classic maritime enter into what's called a contract of affreightment, and it's